Hello, welcome to Dissecting Creativity. My name is Dr. Gerard Puccio. I'm the chair and professor of the International Center for Studies in Creativity at Buffalo State. In this series, what we do is we explore creativity by having a conversation with a well-known thought leader in the field of creativity. In tonight's session, we're going to meet and explore creativity with Dr. Tudor Rickards. Dr. Rickards is a professor emeritus of the Manchester Business School. He's a founder of the Creativity Unit, also founder of the Creativity and Innovation Management Journal, and a true pioneer in the field of creativity in Europe and really worldwide. So let's welcome Dr. Tudor Rickards. Well, Tudor, it's a delight for me to have you participate in this series because you and I have some history. We go back many years. And I've been such a fan of your work and someone who has adopted your work into my own work, and you've had a tremendous influence on me. So to be able to spend half an hour, 45 minutes chatting with you is an absolute delight for me. So thank you very much for agreeing to participate in this. So Tudor, I want to start by exploring your personal history, sure. Your childhood, where you were born, and perhaps how your childhood and developmental experiences might have influenced your interest in creativity. So tell us about where you were born in your childhood.
Sure. Well, before I do that,
yeah.
Could I answer the question that you posed just 5 minutes ago?
Yeah.
And the question was, Tudor, wouldn't you feel better if you took that word tab off? You look much smarter if you took this tab off. But I've got to tell you, I got so excited by that little game that we played that I worked up a really nice story that I could use with this tab sometime during this presentation. So I'm going to keep this on till I get a chance to work in my joke based on the presentation that we just had, if that's
well,
okay.
I look forward to that. Thank you for
I hope
for
I remember it. I
yeah.
hope I remember it now. Okay. Well, and the other thing was really thank you for inviting me. It's been a great pleasure, and Susan and I came in yesterday, and we're really enjoying meeting so many old friends here, as you said. And I figured out I must know at least 40% of the audience, I guess, from the time we've met. It's great to meet you all again. So, where did I come from and so on? I guess most of my friends know that I'm not English. I come from another smaller country called Wales. And I managed to speak the English language a little bit better as time goes by. I can just about get there now. But the Welsh language is very different. So your first question, you told me you're going to ask me about my background. I was born in a part of Wales called the Welsh Valleys. This is in South Wales. And the Welsh Valleys were industrialized with the Industrial Revolution when they discovered coal underneath the valleys. So it became one of the powerhouses for the generation of coal for the whole of the world, in fact, but certainly the United Kingdom. And that led to a certain type of lifestyle for the inhabitants. You've got examples in the United States, I know. And so we were a community, and I lived in a little village called Treforest in one of the valleys. It's the main valley. It's the river that runs through it is called the Taff. And one thing that Welsh people are called are taffies, because they come from the banks of the river Taff. So the river ran through the little village I was born into. The village actually became famous as the home place of someone who you may have heard of. He's a singer called Tom Jones. and Tom Jones actually is a few years younger than me. And to my sadness, I've never met the man. He must have been playing around a few years when I was in school, but we never met, although it's a very small village. I lived in as is the case actually, a terraced house. There were terraced houses in the valley, and each house actually was occupied normally by a family. So we had a small terraced house, and there were 3 generations of us living in this terraced house in South Wales. And at one stage there was my grandfather and grandmother, my mother and father, and myself, and then my younger brother came along. So it was you could say it was a tight-knit family. Mm-hmm. And there probably wasn't quite enough rooms to go around, to tell you the truth. We didn't have much money, but in some ways it didn't matter because the entire community didn't have much money anyway, so we never felt we lacked for much. And I came to the conclusion that the one thing that my upbringing gave me, on reflection, was a sense of security. I'd never actually felt, when I was growing up, that the world was going to deal me any bad cards. And I'm sure it was partly to do with the upbringing that I was having from my parents. And it seems to me it's given me an attitude towards dealing with things ever since that day, where it's pluses and minuses to it. It led me to be rather confident I was going to achieve things. But I think it also made me a bit smug and complacent as well. So you can't win with these things. But that was certainly my recollection, was this type of upbringing in the valleys. And the culture there is rather like a lot of village community cultures. It's a very closed culture. And certainly when I was growing up, it was quite rare for people to stay inside to leave the valley. And if they did leave, they wouldn't come back. So you got a combination of a very close community and then occasionally folk going out. And the other part of the culture that is actually stereotypical almost is that Welsh people from the area that I come from love rugby above all. They don't follow football so much. They follow rugby union. Exactly. And
rugby fan there.
Rugby fan. We lost to South Africa just yesterday, so I'm not too pleased about that. But that being said, rugby, the community actually made its own cultural formulations, and one of the cultural things was through poetry and through choirs. There was a lot of singing and poetry through the culture. And at school, I remember that one of the things that you had to enter in was to become a poet, and the best poet in the school actually won a prize, and it was appreciated. And I won one of those prizes for poetry, and I thought, this is pretty good, because I was suddenly getting a lot of attention without having to do much work. And I thought, I must have a career on this. So it kind of encouraged me in my career choice afterwards to become a teacher, I think. But the emphasis was clearly, a lot of the families wanted their children to do better than the parents. And so there was a lot of emphasis on education, and I guess there was a lot of competition, and I was reflecting on this, and it seemed to me on reflection it was the parents were pushing the children to succeed. So there was a little bit of pressure to go to the local school and win scholarships and so on. And I was fortunate enough to do that. And then I was on this sort of track of, you're going to go to college because that's what you're expected to do. And it was about then when I had my first shock when I went to college, and I discovered there were people there who were cleverer than I was. And this was a big shock to the system. And then I had an even bigger shock when the first class honours degree I expected was deprived of me for some reason or another. And on reflection, it was because possibly I wasn't good enough to get a first class honours degree. Or it might have been because I spent an awful lot of time doing other things as well. But anyway, it
Poetry writing.
Yeah. But by then I was doing a science degree. My degree was actually the same as Teresa Amabile's degree. I was a chemist.
Yeah.
I did a first and second degree in chemistry. And my postdoctoral appointment was a place that we tried to visit in New York just a few months ago to discover it had moved. It was called the Flower and Fifth Avenue Hospital on 105th Street and Fifth Avenue. And they've moved to Valhalla, so it's not there anymore. But I did my postdoctoral work in New York. And then I came back to the UK, where I moved to Merseyside, close to Liverpool. So from the age of 15, where I'd hardly left this little village, I'd moved from this little village to New York, and then I'd moved back to Liverpool, which is a very interesting culture again. So I began to get a view of the world that it's kind of different depending on which part of the world you live in. And at that stage, I was set to become a scientist, I guess. So my early career was more or less as I've described it to you. And so I don't know if that's enough of biographical data.
No, that's terrific. And I had forgotten that you shared the same original discipline as Teresa Amabile, which then makes me wonder, how do you move from chemistry into creativity? And I don't know if you went directly from that work to the business school. So how did you first get interested in creativity? And how did that influence you in your career?
Actually, it's because I think I did something that was pretty creative, and it got me into trouble.
Okay.
And this is my anecdote. I went to work for a company that some of you have heard of called Unilever, and I worked in a research laboratory, a Unilever research laboratory, Port Sunlight, and it was the original laboratory that the Lever fortunes were founded in because they started making soap in the 19th century, first packed soap. It was the origin of marketing. It was Unilever packed soap and so on. And they had then about 500 PhDs doing research into soap. So I was one of the 500 doing research into soap. And my task was to try and make soap less irritant. And at the time, we were using pig's ears to test out the irritancy of soap. So we'd get the ears off deceased pigs and see what effect our soaps would have on these pig's ears.
I'm glad we're having this conversation now rather than before dinner.
Yeah. And briefly then, I think because you want, so to cut a long story short, I felt it might be possible to test the effects of the irritancy of soap by growing seeds and putting the soap onto the growing plants. Mm-hmm. So that was my creative insight, was don't use pig's ears, just try out growing seeds. So I found mustard seed was quite appropriate, and you could use filter papers to grow the mustard seed, and you could test out the irritancy of the detergents. Now this was quite good because you could do a lot more testing, and anyway, it was a messy job working with pig's ears. Mm-hmm. So I started growing the mustard seed in the laboratory, and eventually I had such a crop, I had to remove certain items of equipment so that my seeds could grow for my experiment. And my boss, I still remember him, he was a very distinguished Chinese doctor, was showing some visitors around, and he was showing his laboratory, and he opened one of these shelves, and instead of the equipment, he found my mustard seed growing in the shelf. And then he turned in embarrassment to the next shelf and opened it up, and he found even more mustard seed in the shelf. He was absolutely furious, and there was a spot going for someone to move into a new little research group called New Products and Concepts. Mm-hmm. And within 24 hours, I'd moved from measuring irritancy and detergency into new products and concepts.
So was this an advancement or an exile?
Oh, it was perfect because I suddenly was at home. Yeah. My job then was to come up with creative ideas, hopefully that didn't screw up my boss. so that was how I got into creativity, really. Okay. And I spent 6 years in that department, mm-hmm. and it was very enlightening. The idea was that we'd spend 50% of our time coming up with ideas for the company, mm-hmm. and 50% looking at the processes of discovery and innovation. And that was the core to it, really. Yeah. So I had that opportunity to spend 50% of my time working on creativity. And someone else in the company came back saying, would you believe, I've just been to Buffalo, and they got this conference, they can actually stimulate creativity. I thought this was fantastic. You mean you don't have to wait for it to come to you, someone could help you stimulate your creativity. So I got really interested in creativity because of these rather accidental series of events that were taking place.
So did you follow up and come to Buffalo then? Yeah, did you visit?
Yeah. Not for some years, but the next connection was, because this company had ridiculous, foolish amounts of wealth, mm-hmm. they said, oh, well, if you're interested in that, who might be able to help you? And there was someone who was at the time making a name for himself, and his name was George Prince. Mm-hmm. Yep. And George was inventing or developing what I understood at the time to be a rather complex way of stimulating creativity called synectics. And George came and gave some lectures in the UK that I attended, and that actually started a friendship with George Prince that lasted until he died many years later. And by the time I'd spent some time with him, it was clear to me it was actually possible to increase your chances of getting creative ideas. I wouldn't say to order, but at least there was a probability you'd have mm-hmm. A better chance of coming up with creative ideas. And that, again, was another stimulus for me to get interested in creativity. And then, as this was going on, there was a lecturer from Manchester Business School who was teaching on management, the university, the Unilever people. And I met him during one of the courses he was giving, and I said, I'm quite interested in teaching, and he suggested I take a secondment from Unilever to Manchester Business School. So this would be in 1971. And he discussed it with my boss in Unilever, and the boss said, well, okay, secondment sounds fine. If he doesn't like it, he can come back next year. So that was 1972. And
I'm going to guess you never went back.
I never went back.
Yeah.
I stayed for the rest of my academic career then in Manchester.
Fascinating. All these years, that's the first time I've heard that story.
Yeah, I'm not making it up.
No, I believe you. I believe you.
I just didn't tell so many.
So, well, we've been using the word creativity, and I'm going to ask you to. I know it's quite a challenge for many in the field to come up with a short definition of creativity, or it could be a description. Doesn't necessarily have to be a definition, but how do you describe creativity to others? How do you see it?
Well, after trying for about 40 years, it occurred to me that there's more definitions of creativity than you can wave a stick at. So there's something very interesting happening there. And I came to the conclusion that the way I deal with it is like this. I can give you a working definition of creativity, and all it is a starting point for us to have a conversation about creativity. So my working definition just gets us started. And if you were to ask me tomorrow, I might have a slightly different working definition. So I think over the years, my working definition has tended to be something like, it's a process that leads to the production of new and valued ideas. And that's not my creation, because lots of people have suggested versions of that. So it's a process that leads to the production of new and valued ideas. Now the conversation then comes about in terms of what's new and how new has it got to be, and who's going to do the valuing. So it still doesn't end the definition. It's a kind of open-ended definition that can lead to dialogue or whatever, just like we're having now, I hope.
No, that's fantastic, and I think it's a great conversation starter because those terms, those concepts, new and valued, can be subjective. So you can look at it from an individual perspective or a team perspective or for all of society, humankind. So you've spent a lot of time teaching and training creativity. You started the creativity unit at the Manchester Business School. I know you've done lots of work with corporations. Maybe this is, given your experiences at Unilever and not only coming up with new products, but thinking about the process that you might use to come up with new ideas. Why do you think it's important to teach creativity? Why did you stay at the Manchester Business School working with MBAs, giving them these skills? Why do you think that's important?
Well, I think I was persuaded by discussions with people like yourself and people in Buffalo and many other places that most people just weren't fulfilling their creative potential. And I was thinking particularly at work. You can extend it to education and so on. And I could see it in my workplace that most people in Unilever had far more potential to come up with useful, relevant, innovative ideas than were doing so. And in a way, that was exactly what George Osborne found when he was aware, when he was working in industry, that people just didn't seem to be fulfilling their creative potential at work. So there was something going on in the workplace that was blocking the creative potential of individuals. Now that was just my observations, and it fitted in with what Osborne had thought about and led him to get into his, I think, remarkable notion of brainstorming so many years ago. And they were the kind of things that were leading me to take the path that I took, in fact.
Well, that's a great segue for me to introduce one of your early works, and I know a book that I've borrowed from.
You haven't bought it?
You gave this to me as a gift
Oh,
when I
that's
came
right.
to Manchester.
I didn't
Thought
buy
you
it.
would remember that. You even signed it for me. So creativity and problem solving at work. So lots, just in the title itself, creativity and its connection to problem solving and how to bring this into the workplace. So what were you attempting to do? I mean, there are wonderful strategies in this book, great anecdotes, lots of examples. I've borrowed strategies from this, Night Move, and so forth. What were you attempting to do? Why this book?
Well, to answer that question, I've got to take you back to an earlier book. And the experiences in Unilever left me, I think, like a lot of young researchers, wanting to come up with some explanation or model for the way in which this all works. And my model was, or the question I was asking myself was, is there some way in which people can think about and analyze situations so that they can be more creative? So my first book was written, more or less, was the predecessor to this, with some of the anecdotes and so on in it. And it was called Problem Solving Through Creative Analysis. And it seemed to me that it wasn't just enough to be a good problem solver, but you should understand the processes of problem solving as well. It's a meta-level thing. So I wanted to come up with a model that would explain how a technique could be constructed to produce creativity in a more successful way. And I used this term creative analysis because I thought it was a mixture of the creative result and the analysis in the first place, creative analysis. Now, I approached that very much like a scientist would approach it, or an engineer, and I came up with what was a very sort of functional attempt to split down the big creativity techniques into a series of sub-techniques. And I thought if I could do that and then analyze, I could end up with a way of helping creativity in any situation. So that's what I was looking for. Now, that was the first book, and I came to the conclusion that that task was too big for me. And the second book, I decided I'd try the same way to work and encourage people to find ways of being more creative. But instead of looking for a grand universal model, I'd just suggest, as you virtually said, some recipes through experience. So this was a far less ambitious book. It didn't attempt anything too theoretical, but as it was drawing on the experiences.
It's practical, yeah.
Yeah, it's
That's
much
what
more
I'm,
practical.
yeah.
Can I add, I know but you mentioned a particular technique in this book, which you mentioned, which was a night move. Yeah. Now, this is a very poignant story. I don't know how much of this you know, Gerard, but the inventor of this technique was a brilliant student of mine called Peter Elliott. And Peter Elliott was a medical doctor who came to the business school to get a business education. He was undoubtedly the best student I've ever had. And he tragically died in a motor accident about 6 months after leaving the business school. And the only piece of work he ever did with me was the idea that creativity could be understood as a knight's move. Now, this appealed to me because knight's move is actually a term used in medicine to describe a certain type of way in which people with certain conditions don't think in a very logical way. And so he'd already studied the medicine of knight's move thinking. Now, he didn't know that I was also an obsessive chess player. And it did seem to me there's something really curious about the way the knight moves in chess. It's the only piece that can break away from the linear bounds of the board and get to places that none of the other pieces can get. So everything seemed to make it a very exciting technique. And we were working towards thinking this is probably something that relates to, but is slightly different from, a lot of Edward de Bono's work on lateral thinking. And if anyone wants to do a master's on an area that's been understudied, I'd recommend knight's move thinking as a very interesting topic.
Wonderful. So you were talking about a student that you worked with and the relationship with that student and reciprocal learning. How did you find your work being accepted in a business school? Because you were way ahead of the curve in bringing creativity into a business school environment. What was that like? What stories have been shared with you? What kind of impact have you had? Can you look back and think of examples of individuals who were changed or able to bring this into their work? How did that go?
Well, even the question brings back floods of memories of things that worked and that didn't work. I think it was true to say that the business school was quite an innovative school of itself. It was one of two schools that were founded in the 1960s in the UK because we had nothing to compete with the big business schools in America, and particularly the Ivy League schools in Stanford and so on. And one was in London and one was in Manchester. And Manchester wanted to be a very innovative school. So in a way, there was scope there for creativity. The first director quite liked the idea of having a lecture in creativity. So I was the first lecturer in creativity, certainly in the UK, full-time. As far as I could tell, it might have been outside the UK anyway, the first. And he also appointed on the very same day the first lecturer in entrepreneurship. And this was about 1981, 2, something like that. And the Guardian newspaper, which was then the old Manchester Guardian, found this absolutely hilarious that there were going to be these two academics. One was going to be creative and swinging from the chandelier, and the other was going to be going around selling all the ideas that the creative person had come up with. And that was that. But broadly speaking, I found the structure of the university I was in was not totally compatible with the idea of creativity as a discipline. And with just 20 minutes before I started, I had a fascinating conversation, brief one, with Jo. Jo's over somewhere here. Jo Udes. And she was sharing some of the ways in which it's not easy to get creativity to be taken seriously as a research topic. And I felt I was succeeding in 2 steps, then going one back to get creativity on the main master's curriculum in the business school. And frankly, that was an ebb and flow that went on for about 30 years that I've been trying. So one of the reasons I founded the Creativity Research Unit at Manchester Business School was to try and get some stability for some of those lean years where I knew that creativity was going to take a pounding by people who just didn't like the idea. I mean, it had some successes, and the strategy was actually to reach out to Europe and try and form a network of people in Europe that would sustain each other, because they were probably, like myself, struggling to get credibility inside the university system. So that was one of my interests, of going from sort of national to a European-wide network of people.
I'm curious about something that you mentioned early on about frustrated employees, or employees who aren't able to achieve their creative potential. You're working in a business school, you're preparing MBAs to go off into, most of them, corporate life. Why do you think, why is it so important? Why is it important for organizations to embrace creativity? Why be concerned about whether employees are achieving their creative potential or not?
Well, you could just about say it's not important in a certain business model where the person at the top has got the capacity to come up with all the ideas that the organization needs. Now, those days are gone, and they're partly gone because the complexity of business life is changed. And you can no longer foresee a situation where all the ideas that the company needs will be generated by the people at the top. Once you've got there, you've got to say, well, where are the ideas going to come from, except from elsewhere in the organization? And once you take that route, you're into rethinking what you mean about where is our creativity needed. Now, IBM just recently has announced that, as far as they're concerned, the company has got 20,000 leaders. And what they're saying is that everybody in IBM these days is expected to be, and in a way they're implying a modern, and I consider this to be a creative leader. And the answer is that, apart from it being a desperate waste of human potential, then companies are not going to survive unless they find strategies that liberate the potential of their people.
So you talk about constraints, and some of your recent work around leadership talks about constraints. What gets in the way? What prevents people in organizations from reaching their creative potential?
Well, I think I've done very little work that's innovative, but I think that a lot of the points are thoroughly covered by people that we understand in the field. I'm thinking, for example, there's a lot of work in psychology about the basic fear a lot of people have got, the insecure fear of change, for example. So the fear that something new might be harmful is almost a universal condition. So if that's the case, it's a universal barrier, and certain types of cultures and structures and techniques can help. So the fear of change is one powerful example of it. I think that goes pretty much across cultures that I've looked into. There's one or two others. Someone actually used an acronym in the little game we played about, was it What's Good About It, I think, was the acronym. And these little things are reminders about the dangers of people fearing change, and I'm doing it partly as a cultural and an ingrained sort of condition.
Given your experience, do you see a change in the receptivity to creativity as you work with students or organizations, as you look over your years of experience in interacting with and preparing students as well as interacting with organizations?
That's a very good question. In fact, I'll use this question
Feel free
to illustrate my little tab story here.
Oh, good. I've been waiting for this.
Well, you see, I felt that you're going to ask me a question that's so difficult that I couldn't possibly answer it. So I figured out that you've already got the answer to this question in what you did at the beginning of the day. So all you have to do, folks, is have a look at those words you got on the back there and assemble them into some sort of meaningful phrase or words, and this will give you a better answer to this brilliant question that you're asking me than what I'm coming up with. I don't know. I can take this off now. I don't think I've seen much difference in the way people generally respond to the challenges of creativity. I think some people get it straight away, some people take longer to get it, and some people never get it. And I don't think I've seen much difference in those sort of crude classifications since I've started quite a long time ago. And if I can add to that, a little bit of research we've done on teams, we're pretty sure we observe three types of team in our work right across the world, and they tend to be underperforming teams. They tend to be standard teams who do what you expect them to do. And occasionally there's teams that we call dream teams who exceed not only your expectations, but their expectations. And I think I'd say that's about 10, 15% of teams that you work with in all sorts of categories. And that's where something's happening through what I would consider creative leadership and creative teamwork that makes the difference. People are waving hands at suggesting we're getting a bit close to the end of this, is that?
No, I think those are questions that are being collected from the audience that we can pose to you at the end. But I have more questions for you.
Oh, I better put this back on.
Yeah, you may need that. So you just mentioned leadership, and your most recent work is focused on leadership. The book that you're working on now, I think it's a revision to a book on leadership. So what do you see the connection to be between leadership and creativity? What's drawn you now to focus your current thinking on leadership?
It's quite remarkable, to me anyway. The more I worked on leadership, the more it occurred to me that leadership and creativity are so closely connected, and for whatever reason, most of the teaching on leadership ignores creativity, and most of the teaching on creativity ignores leadership. And the more I worked, I began to see how closely connected they actually were. And for example, in creativity, you talk about big C and little c creativity, which is the creativity that we associate with the universal, the general, and the creativity that everyone's got within them. Same thing with leadership. For 100 years, we were fascinated by the great leader. Now we believe the important thing, like IBM, is that everyone's got leadership potential. And that extends to the family, to the school, to the church, yeah? And so you've got big C, little c, creativity, and so on. It's quite clear that much of leadership is different from management Management is actually performing functions that have been identified. Leadership in some way is to do with helping, and the words that are being used since the 1980s is corporate vision. Now, you tell me what's unconnected with creativity with a corporate vision, and yet the people teaching corporate vision in strategy hardly ever mention creativity. It's crazy, or at least it's myopic.
Yeah, yeah.
If I may coin a phrase.
So, with the work that you're doing around leadership, are you trying to infuse more creative thinking into leadership? Is that what you're attempting to do?
Well, where I feel most comfortable is to actually be a teacher. And the book that I've written, the textbook, starts off saying the most important leader that you'll study in this textbook is yourself. But equally, the book's about dilemmas. And I don't believe it's helpful to tell people what they should know about leadership or creativity. It's some way it has to be facilitated. So the book tries to find a way of helping people find their own way forward so they can become a better leader. So I'm interested in education. I think a way of doing it is to help people discover for themselves how they can become a better leader, if that's the way we're doing it. And the way I think I've found most useful is to pick up what's not found in many of the leadership books, is to talk about the dilemmas of leadership. The book's actually called Dilemmas of Leadership. Many of the books talk as if leadership is easy as long as you're a great leader. Now, that's nonsense. Every great leader actually faces great challenges, but working through the dilemmas is very important. And what I want in my students is to learn from the dilemmas that other people face so they vicariously can actually develop their own leadership and develop better, not just thinking about leadership, but acting on leadership. So that's where I'm coming from.
Interesting. So you're making me think, in the literature that I've been reading around innovation, one of the major barriers to innovation in organization is an aversion to taking risks. And that often those in formal leadership positions, it's a very frightening thing to try out new ideas, because when you're trying out new ideas, the possibility of failure goes up, and it then calls into question your leadership. So speaking of dilemmas, there's a dilemma there. So how does one go about convincing or assisting organizations, leaders, in being more open to taking risks?
Well, yeah. Well, I'm not sure that's necessarily the path. If we all became risk takers, we wouldn't survive a generation. So the question is, how do we balance risk with security? Now, it is true that the larger the organization, the more personal investment the leader's got to protect their position. So there's a tendency to protect your position by not taking risks. And however, it turns out that a lot of great leaders are rather reckless and they take stupid risks. And sometimes they come off and sometimes they don't. Now, that's a very Darwinian model of progress. And the business schools quite like the idea of helping people to get to balanced risk. Now, I haven't got much time for a lot of research into economics, but where they have got it right is this notion of risk-taking and the idea that when you look carefully at the decisions that people make in organizations, by and large, it does seem as if there are huge blind spots into what's called rational decision-making. And that's one of the reasons we end up with the economic issues that we've had since 2008, which replicates things that happened 50 years ago and beyond. So there is something about risk. But I must say, I worry a bit that the creativity community thinks that if only people can take more risks, everything's going to be fine. And I'm just as concerned about that as I am about people not taking risks. Of course, the only people who are perfect are those in business schools who teach these balanced approaches.
I was listening to James Dyson. His first name, is it James Dyson? Yeah. He was being interviewed by National Public Radio, and he was asked, what would you do to change the educational process? And he said the first thing I would do is to help students understand it's okay to fail, because the way the system is set up is you get punished to fail, and therefore what students really work hard at doing is to never do something that will put them at risk of failing. So the audience here has put together some questions that have been handed to me. So yeah, get your favorite word ready. And I've just glanced at some of these. And the first one that struck me, which I think is a really fascinating question, is what is the best way to teach creativity to employees in an organization?
There's no best way. You should think about the specific organization, and there will be a way that works for the people engaged in the teaching or the training and the situation in the organization. There is no best way of achieving organizational success. It's one of the mindsets is to believe there is. And the more you can think about creativity as occurring in a context, as Teresa said, creativity in context, that's the best you can hope for. Can I come up with a way that works for me and this organization in this particular context? Now, unfortunately, it might be different from the way you tried last time, and that's another of the blocks, is success can actually block you from trying something different, just like failure can block you from trying something different.
Interesting, yeah. So I'm going to end with two questions, and they're questions posed by the audience, one more personal, one more about the field. Which one do you want first?
You're going to get personal, or you want me to get personal?
No, this is why I'm asking you. It's going to get personal, yeah.
Factor who depends.
Yeah.
Oh, you want me to get personal? All right.
Well,
yeah, okay.
I'll just choose.
No, go on,
I'll
go on.
choose.
Do me a personal one.
All right. So what? It's not me. It's from the audience. So what do you consider to be your greatest contribution to the field up until this point?
Well, you won't be surprised now. I often ask myself that. I know it's not. I don't consider myself an innovative researcher. I think what I've been able to do is work with other people to create situations in which together we can do creative things. And I'm rather pleased that when I started this work, there really wasn't much confidence that creativity could be consolidated in universities in Europe. And I think we're doing a lot better job now. I'm proud of the fact that I've made my little bit of a contribution through the journal and so on.
Okay. So, well, this is a build off of that. Looking forward to the future, the last question from the audience, or the last question that I'll pose to you, which comes from the audience, is what do you think's next in creativity research? Where do you think it needs to go? What's not being examined that you think ought to be examined?
Well, I just wish I was doing research into creativity again, because I think the big change in the last 10 years has been the change in social media. And so you can write off about 70% of the things that we were doing before social media came up and start figuring out again what's the situation now because of social media. I don't know, but I can't believe that the ways in which you work together in teams is now the same as it was 15 years ago before social media and so on. Educationally, the way in which we interact with our students is so different, again because of technology. Just quickly, we run an exercise and we ask students to tell us about their favorite book. And this is always great fun. But a few years ago, I noticed more and more students were getting onto their smartphones, going to Google, and they were getting straight onto Amazon and telling me what they were getting from Amazon, which was their favorite book. It's changed the way that we interact with everybody. So I think the interaction between social media, technology, and people is a huge area of investigation. I think we know virtually nothing about the creative organization. I don't understand what a creative organization looks like, and I don't think anyone else does either, but people talk as if they do. There's a huge opportunity for studying what is the nature of the creative organization, how would we even characterize it, because you see it's a one-off. There is only one Google, there's only one Microsoft, so there's no traditional scientific way
yeah.
of studying them. So you need new methods, new methodologies, and so on. So my own kind of preference is constantly to look for interpretive answers rather than the classical rational model. And I think this is creativity is ideally suited for studying in an interpretive style rather than a old-fashioned mechanistic positive style. But frankly, an awful lot of the creativity research is still embedded in the old rational model of education. So there's great opportunities for going down that route, I'd say, as well.
Well, Tudor, we're up against time, and the time that we have is not sufficient to explore your thinking and your career and your success. But this has been a personally meaningful interview for me because you are the reason that I ended up at the University of Manchester, because of your visit to Buffalo as a Alex F. Osborne visiting scholar in
that's right. I've got cramp, don't worry about it.
mid-1980s. And if you recall, I was the one who came up to Toronto to pick you up after you broke your arm playing tennis.
Oh, goodness me.
And it was in that car ride, back to Buffalo, you told me about the University of Manchester and
That's right.
Reg Talbot and the work that you were doing. So you were the reason I ended up in Manchester. So this was personally very meaningful to me. As an expression of my appreciation and a tribute to the legacy of Sid Parnes, in May, I don't know that I mentioned this to you, but we graduated our 500th student from our program. And as an expression of my appreciation, I'd like to present this T-shirt.
Thank you very much indeed.
So thank you very much, Tudor.
I will wear it with pride.
And that concludes this session of Dissecting Creativity. We invite you to visit other sessions that you'll find in our website, as well as look at information about the International Center for Studies in Creativity and its many programs. Thank you for joining us. And thank you again, Tudor.